Welcome back to the channel. My name is Sagar, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about advanced analytics. Think of this video as an intro to advanced analytics. Why am I talking about advanced analytics? So I think that there's a disconnect between a lot of fans, players, media members in terms of what analytics provides, how they should be digested, what's the application to the actual sport of basketball. I think advanced analytics gets a bad rep because a lot of people assume that these are numbers that are used to try to solve the game of basketball, and it completely ignores the eye test. And I'm here to say that that's not the case. That shouldn't be the case. And I want to kind of rewrite that narrative, right? So I think, the eye test, while it can be incredibly great, it is very subjective. There are just clearly certain people that have better eye tests, certain people that are worse. And with the use of advanced analytics, hopefully that this can improve people's eye test and further their analysis at a higher level in terms of debating about players, their legacies, how they're performing on a game-to-game basis, and the overall way the game of basketball is played and the most efficient way to play the game of basketball. So I'm not here to say completely ignore the eye test and just use numbers and that's the way that's the best way to analyze basketball. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that in order to best analyze the game of the sport, you have to watch the game at a consistent level, analyze it based on your own interpretation and your kind of intuition, and then use the advanced analytics to help you contextualize and understand and hopefully further understand things that you might have missed with just the eye test. And so in today's video, I want to go over 4 different advanced stats and hopefully break them down very simply in a way where it can be applied immediately and understood from an eye test perspective, and therefore help players and fans better understand the game of basketball. So without further ado, the first statistic I want to talk about is true shooting percentage. So I have a list of all the stats here, and I'll go through them, so don't mind me if I'm looking down on my laptop. But with true shooting percentage, a simple definition: true shooting percentage is a measure of a player's shooting percentage when free throws and three-pointers are taken into account. So I'm sure everyone watching this video is obviously familiar with field goal percentage. Simply the number of makes a player has divided by the shot attempts that player took during that game. Simple example, if a player made 5 shots and took 10 shots, that player shot 50% from the field. 5 over 10, 50%, right? So why use true shooting percentage? Why can't we just use field goal percentage? Well, the point of field goal percentage is to measure a player's efficiency. And while it does do that, it does not account for the value of free throws made and three-pointers made relative to the overall field goal percentage. And so true shooting percentage takes a step further and helps contextualize the actual efficiency in which a player is shooting. So on the screen right now, we have a formula for true shooting percentage. So in the numerator, as you can see, it starts off with 0.5 times the number of free throws made plus the total 2-pointers made plus 1.5 times 3-pointers made. So 1.5 indicates the value of threes being greater than twos. Obviously threes are 1.5 times bigger than 2. And then 0.5 indicates the relative value of a free throw made compared to the other shots. In the denominator, we have total field goal attempts, right? Just like field goal percentage, it has the field goal attempts. But in this case, we also have total free throw attempts multiplied by a factor of 0.44 in order to make it a more relative scale. Simplified, that comes out to 0.5 of total points, so half of total points, divided by field goal attempts plus 0.44 of total free throw, or multiplied by the total free throw attempts. And at the end, it spits out a value that gives us a player's true shooting percentage. And so why is this important, right? So a lot of fans like to take the surface level analysis of, oh, this player shot sub 50% from the field, this player shot sub 40% from the field. He must have been an inefficient player that game, or even for the course of the season. Simply put, that's not always the case. I'll give you guys a simple example. So back to the 5 for 10 example. Let's say player A is 5 for 10 from the field, and player B is also 5 for 10 from the field. But player A was 5 for 10 from 2-point range, while player B was 5 for 10 from 3-point range. That means player A had 10 points, whereas player B had 15 points. 5 times 3, 15, 5 times 2, 10. On the same amount of shot attempts, player B had more points than player A. So logically, player B was more efficient than player A because on the same amount of shots, they generated more points and therefore was more efficient, which ultimately leads to more success for the team. And so, despite those two players having the same exact field goal percentage, clearly one player was more efficient. And that's where true shooting percentage comes in. And I'm not gonna do the exact calculation right now, but true shooting percentage would spit out a higher percentage number for the player that had 15 points versus the player that had 10 points. And that would allow us to further contextualize how efficient each player was. And James Harden, Damian Lillard, those are just a few guys who are perfect examples of this. Historically, they've been criticized for having lower field goal percentages than their contemporaries, whether that's LeBron, KD, or Steph. But the reality is they've been probably just as efficient, maybe a slightly less efficient than those guys because of their shot profile. Like these guys, James Harden in particular, is number 2 behind Steph Curry in most three-pointers made in NBA history. And a lot of his shots came from that range, obviously, but more importantly, a lot of his shots came from the free throw line. And so that further increases his efficiency because he also shot at an 85% plus clip from the free throw line. And so when you look at the totality of his shot profile and then you do the true shooting percentage conversion, all of a sudden that 40% from the field isn't truly indicative of Harden's efficiency. And that's just one of many examples in which that we can analyze a player's true shooting percentage and understand, okay, this player is actually this efficient and this player is maybe not as efficient as we initially thought. And other examples include, players shooting a high shooting percentage, but their volume of shots is extremely low. So obviously we can't say that player is the most efficient player because maybe they don't have nearly as much volume as a Nikola Jokic or a Steph Curry. And so you can't just use this stat as okay, if this guy has the highest true shooting percentage, he must be the most efficient player. No, that's where the mistakes happen. That doesn't account for the shot profile, the total number of shots, the usage rate, and a lot of other factors that need to be accounted for and that are accounted for with the eye test and other analytics as well. So that's true shooting percentage. Then the next stat I want to talk about is assist to turnover ratio. Once again, simply put, assist to turnover ratio is the number of assists an individual player accumulates before one turnover. So how many assists does a player get on average before they turn the ball over? Historically speaking, the best and greatest assist to turnover ratios, you'd have to go back to Magic Johnson, where he was 5 assists for every 1 turnover, which is absolutely incredible. Or in a modern day context, like Halliburton, who I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I believe he is also approaching that 5 assists to 1 turnover ratio. So what this does is it gives us as fans an insight onto who the most efficient playmakers in the NBA are. And again, what are the downsides of these statistics? Why can't we blindly look at assist to turnover ratio as the indicator of who the best playmaker in basketball is? Well, the perfect example would be a guy like Tyus Jones. So Tyus Jones has led the league in assist to turnover ratio on multiple different occasions. So if you look at that statistic in and of itself and say, okay, well, Tyus Jones must be the best playmaker in basketball. Well, that's not truly necessarily the case because, one, Tyus Jones doesn't have the volume of ball handling responsibilities that a guy like Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, or even LeBron James may have. And two, you might argue, well, okay, maybe because his assist to turnover ratio is high, we should give him more ball handling responsibilities. Well, sure, maybe he'll be able to prove that he is one of the best playmakers in the league, if not the best, but there's other reasons for why he might not get playing time, like his inability to play defense at a high level, his lack of size and strength, or maybe his inability to score at a level that compensates for that lack of defense. And so there's a lot of factors involved that you have to contextualize this overall statistic, right? So we can't just say, okay, look at his assist to turnover ratio, he must be the best playmaker in the league. On the flip side, a guy like Luka might not necessarily have the best assist to turnover ratio, but when we watch the game, clearly Luka is one of the most talented passers we have ever seen. And in order to contextualize why his assist to turnover ratio might be lower, we can look at his ball handling responsibilities, his responsibility to score 35 plus on a nightly basis. And scoring that at that high of a level requires players to take more risk, and more risk on an offensive scale leads inherently to more turnovers. And those turnovers aren't necessarily bad because it's needed for Luka to score those amount of points. And so with all those factors in play, we can further understand, okay, what assist to turnover ratio is and when it's useful. So when it is useful is maybe a guy like Chris Paul, who might have just as many ball handling responsibilities as a Luka Doncic, but has a better assist to turnover ratio. That you can look at and be like, wow, Chris Paul is truly an all-time playmaker when it comes to passing, making the right reads, and protecting the basketball. Awesome. So that's true shooting percentage and assist to turnover ratio. The third stat I want to talk about is value over replacement. Value over replacement, otherwise known as VORP, is a stat that measures how many more wins a player would produce if they were substituted for a replacement level player. So what does that mean in a real life example? So let's just take Steph Curry on the Golden State Warriors. If he were to get replaced by an average NBA player, how many less wins or more wins would that team get? Because Steph Curry is universally recognized as one of the greatest players of all time, one of the most impactful players of all time, the question would be, how many less wins would the Warriors have given the removal of Steph Curry for an average player? And so VORP gives us this number and gives us a ranking of who leads this category. And so we've seen historically specific examples of this happening in real time. In the 2019-20 season, when Steph Curry was hurt, the Warriors were barely on pace to win maybe 20 to 25 games. The very next season, with a similar roster construction, the Warriors won anywhere from 40 to 48 games. So clearly that's a difference of anywhere from 15 to 25 games that Steph Curry is making. Now the shortcomings with VORP, for example, is that it doesn't fully encapsulate that difference. VORP, the league leaders in VORP might be around 9 to 11, but obviously we've seen historically some of the greatest players of all time, they are adding significantly more wins than 9 and 11 wins. What it does do, it still allows us to give a breakdown and a list of the most valuable players according to VORP, and thus us allowing to further contextualize and compare who the most impactful and truly valuable players in the NBA are. And what this can do is, one, it can validate the eye test and say, oh wow, I've been watching this player for months. He's clearly, like, in my eye, one of the best, most impactful players, and the VORP backs it up. Or it can allow us to take a step back and say, wow, maybe I'm overvaluing how good this player has been this year. You know, their VORP doesn't align with what I perceive them to be offensively as a basketball player. Maybe I'm looking too much on the offense. Maybe Rudy Gobert, for example, maybe I'm analyzing his offense too much and I'm not looking at his significant defensive impact. You know, maybe I'm going to change the way I watch basketball and I'm going to watch it more so on the defense. Oh, okay, now I see Rudy Gobert and he's impacting every shot, defending every play. Wow, I can understand why the advanced analytics might reflect a different narrative than what I had in my head. And so this is the goal. This is the whole point, to question your beliefs, to understand that maybe what you're seeing isn't the full picture. And you might need some statistics, not to just immediately change your opinion, but to further understand and watch the game in a different way than what you previously did. And so hopefully with VORP, true shooting percentage, assist to turnover ratio, we as fans and myself and you guys can continue to do so. And the last but not least statistic I want to talk about today is on-off net rating. So simply put, it is a player's offensive rating per 100 possessions minus a player's defensive rating per 100 possessions. So let's break this down very simply. What is an offensive rating per 100 possessions? All that means is how much is the team going to score if they are given 100 possessions on average. For the defensive rating is how many points is the team going to allow if they're given 100 possessions to defend. So why use 100 possessions? Well, 100 possessions allows us to have an equal measurement for all teams in the NBA. It's also typically the amount of possessions that are given in an individual game. And it allows us to have a standardized stat because some teams have more possessions, some teams have less, and that can obviously fluctuate the offensive and defensive rating. So by taking a flat 100 possessions, everyone's on an even playing field in terms of comparison perspective. So a really good example would be, and this is just a team example, but we can get into a player example as well. But the highest rated offensive rating for the NBA this year was the Denver Nuggets with an offensive rating of 123 points per 100 possessions, meaning they score 123 points when they're given 100 possessions on average. To contrast that and to bring cool comparison, when Giannis is on the floor, Giannis Antetokounmpo for the Milwaukee Bucks, the two-time MVP, two-time DPOY, all-time great, the Bucks have an offensive rating of 126. So 126 for the Bucks versus the league-leading Denver Nuggets at 123. That's when Giannis is on the floor. When Giannis is subbed out, the Bucks have an offensive rating of 107, which would be by far the worst in the NBA. This leaves us with an offensive rating differential of nearly 19 points per 100 possessions. My goodness, that is incredibly impactful and just encapsulates the tremendous level of impact that Giannis provides for the Milwaukee Bucks. How god-awful they are without him on the floor. Again, this is not a perfect stat for individual impact. On-off ratings have so many different variables like lineup combinations, specific roles, minutes played. You don't want to look at a small sample size because that could be indicative of a lot of noise, and it's not necessarily what the player will do in a long-term sample. And so there's a lot of these factors that you have to account for. But generally speaking, we can take our context of understanding, okay, I'm looking at the game, I'm watching the game of basketball. Clearly they're way better when Giannis is on the floor, but how much better are they? Stats like these can really help contextualize. And on the other hand, we can be watching a player and see, wow, I really think they're an impactful player, but we see their on-off rating and it's not adding up. Is it perhaps the role they're playing on the team? Is it the specific lineups? Maybe they're playing with more bench units and that's overall reducing their impact on the floor. Is it the sample size of minutes? So those are the questions that you have to ask yourself when you're analyzing on-off and not just take it as face value. But again, in a general sense, it's a really nice stat that can provide us the impact of an individual player relative to their team and allow us to compare some of the best players in the league. And in fact, when you look at some of the best players in the league that are constantly in the MVP discussion, they constantly have the highest VORPs, they constantly have the highest on-off ratings, they're constantly having the highest true shooting percentages, and it's not a coincidence. And surprisingly enough, there are also guys that are maybe not as touted from a PRA perspective, which a lot of fans like to analyze, is points, rebounds, and assists. And so a player might be phenomenal in those three categories as a totality, but their impact may not nearly be as good as you thought. And so with that, those are the 4 analytics I've talked about. Hopefully I was able to break it down in a pretty simple and applicable nature. Hopefully you guys are able to analyze and understand the game of basketball at a higher level now. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Let me know if you want another video of other advanced analytics, and I can hopefully try to break it down even more simply. And both us, myself, we can continue to watch the game at a higher level. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video.